right, let's talk about how do you decide where to work? What kind of company should you be applying for? There are a number of principles I will share with you, though there's also a lot of relativity to it based on your own preferences. First thing I'll go over is the spectrum of bureaucracy through entrepreneurialism. So, companies are going to range in size vastly from having, say, thousands and thousands of employees, tens of thousands of employees, all the way up to startups which only have a few employees. And there's a full spread in between. Typically, companies that are on the larger side are going to have, there's pros and cons to being more on either side. But working at a large company, you'll typically have a significant amount of resources at your disposal, from marketing collateral to training to product updates, potentially better benefits, potentially, this is a big question mark, potentially better pay. There definitely will be more structure. When you get that many people together, there are going to be more rigid rules and processes. As I mentioned, more training, both sales training, product, and company training. So there's also going to be more red tape, more bureaucracy, frankly, more liberal policies like anti-racism training, like DEI type mandatory training, etc. Also, at these large companies, you're 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 10,000 employees. And so from my experience, having worked at a company that had about 4,000 employees, it's very easy to feel kind of lost. Like, what difference does my contribution actually make to the company as a whole? Additionally, the more structures in place can oftentimes hinder a lot of growth. There tends to be, like, I tried to get multiple contracts approved from our legal team, and the process was frankly arduous. And that wasn't just a legal issue, that was an issue across any department working with them, simply because there was so much red tape and bureaucracy. Now, on the opposite end, working at a startup, a small company, etc., there will typically be less structure. It'll be typically more, sink or swim, figure it out on your own. But that also means if you take initiative, for example, instead of relying on the company to train you on how to sell, train you on how to learn about the product, the value you can offer, you read books, you listen to podcasts, you talk to other employees. If you take that level of initiative, you can grow typically through the company faster, because whereas, for example, at many companies I've worked at, there have been minimum timelines in which you are required to be in a role before you promote, regardless of your performance. Now, for example, at the first software company I worked at, it had about 230 employees. I went into the entry-level sales role and I was crushing it. There was very little training, but I was spending at least, say, 5 hours a day reading, listening to audiobooks, etc. And so I accelerated remarkably quickly. There was a rule in place that you are not allowed to promote within 1 year. Some companies, especially bigger ones, that can be even longer, potentially. That being said, because it was a relatively small company, I was able to print out spreadsheets of my performance, and I brought it to the head of sales, and again, this is where you position it from what they would want to hear. Instead of me stomping my foot and saying, I want to promote faster, I took the data, the metrics, I brought it to the VP of sales, and I said, hey, I know I've only been here for 8 months so far. Here are the numbers that I've reached so far, the amount of success I've had. I kind of feel like I'd be able to contribute more value to the company as a whole if I was in a full sales cycle sales rep role, account executive role. Do you agree, or am I missing something? He loved it. And I got promoted even though there was a rule in place. So even at smaller companies, there's going to be flexibility even if there is structure. Whereas at a large company, you can bring in $1 million deal. They're still not going to make an exception typically, because the larger the company, typically the more fearful they are of litigation or lawsuits. And so if they make an exception for me, what happens if Billy over here files a lawsuit because he's not doing badly, but he just wasn't driven enough to approach the VP of sales? You get where I'm going with that. So there's less structure, which can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. Also, there will be more growth if the company is growing. Now, hear me out. It is very hard for a company to grow from $800 million to $1 billion annually. That is a huge jump, even though it is a small percentage of growth. Whereas a company that's growing from, say, 10 million to 100 million, that's a smaller dollar amount, but it is a significantly larger percentage. And what that typically means is additional growth opportunities. Your manager might get promoted, which could open up that position, or the SMB account executive could get more territory, get promoted, and then you can backfill quicker. Because again, the more a company is growing, the more opportunity there will be to promote. Also, as a direct comparison between the typically impersonal nature of working at a large company, at a small company, part of the whole sink and swim thing is, if you are swimming, you tend to get good recognition for it because the company is more depending on you than, say, a big company that, let's be real, may not even know that you exist. So it tends to be more personal. You can actually see the impact you're having on the company to a greater extent. Okay. The final thing I'll point out on a similar note, not only as far as your own contribution, but the company itself will likely care more about you as a person than at, say, a large company. Now, I want to go back to what I said about growth, because growth, in my opinion, is about the most important thing in this entire conversation. Like, if you hear nothing else, hear this. Growth creates momentum, which creates opportunity. So if you get plugged into a software company that is, for example, low growth, meaning they're not selling all that much more this year than they were last year or the year before that, if it's a slow growth company, there's going to be fewer people promoting, which means you'll be slower to promote, whereas the opposite is also true. So if you want to make a lot of money, if you want to promote quickly, my recommendation is find growth. So ideal situation, get to a growing country / a growing state. Yes, in the world of remote work, that's a little bit less important, but it's still something worth noting. Growing industry. It is very hard to sell a product or a software into a industry that is constantly trying to pinch pennies to make ends meet, whereas industries that are innovating, that are growing, you'll tend to find that they're willing to spend more money to help them grow even faster. Therefore, being in a fast-growing industry is vital. Every industry is either growing or dying every single year. And so get plugged into like what is going on in the world to figure out what industries you should be a part of. And another layer down is going to be growing companies. So even within a growing industry, there's some companies that are going to be growing. There's some companies that are going to be dying. Obviously, it's better to be in the companies that are growing. So as we get into the interview process and questions, you'll notice a significant amount of the questions are going to be asking them how quickly they are growing, because that is one of the most important determining factors in what company, at least I would recommend you work for. An important thing to remember, it is very, very hard to grow in your career, whether by way of promotion or compensation, faster than the company you are working with is growing. It's hard to grow for a company to grow faster than the industry itself is growing, and it's even harder if the industry is shrinking. Think about it like this, like I'm a big fan of The Office TV show. You know, Dwight, like literally the first season of The Office, we knew what Dwight's aspirations were. He wanted to be the regional manager of Dunder Mifflin Paper in Scranton. It was not until season 9 that this actually happened. Why? If you really break it down, it's because one, even though he had only one person above him, he had to wait for that one person to either move on or die. Like, if a company's not growing, there's a limited number of positions available, and so it took him forever to be able to promote. So instead of waiting for someone to move on or die, if you go to a growing company, there's going to be a constant need for additional position. In the Dunder Mifflin example, if they were growing, they'd be opening up more branches, and he could have been moved quicker into a management position over another branch. Okay. Higher growth rate in a company typically equals faster promotions and bigger raises. Now, it's important to know as you get into this world. Again, our parents, our grandparents' generations were big on staying at a company for the long haul. In this existing economy, especially in software sales, that is not incentivized. While in 4.5 years at my first software company, I received a $10,000 bump in my salary. Each time I have switched companies, my salary has increased by 40 to 50%. No small margin there. So when you're looking for companies, yes, look for high growth, but don't feel like you have to be married to that company for always and eternity. Anticipate you'll be there for, let's say, 3 to 5 years. Higher profit margins as you're evaluating companies tends to mean higher compensation. So as you're looking for companies, try to get a feel for what is their profit margin. And again, part of that you can gather from what is your growth rate, what is your average deal size, that kind of line of questions. But that's why, for example, selling used books at $2 per book is not going to allow the company to pay you as much as if you were selling software, which is basically pure profit once the software is developed. Another thing as you're deciding where to work is going to be whether you want to work in person versus remote, and if you're willing to travel, all of which are great questions as you go into the interview process. As I mentioned earlier, especially as you're early in your software sales career, I do highly recommend at least a hybrid approach, if not working in person, at least for the first few years. That's up to you though. Both options are going to be available. Okay. Now with those principles under your belt, we're going to jump into, in the next section, the job hunt and the interview process. We'll see you there.